This chapter is about the army during the reign of Edward III. Everything you wanted to know but were afraid to ask. Stay tuned. The Hundred Years' War, in a sense, is a war of professionals and amateurs, during which the professionalism of the English army grew, and after it, with some lag, the professionalism of the French. Back in the time of Edward I, the English army formation system combined the Anglo-Saxon order of manning and Norman order of recruitment based on the feudal rules began to fail. The Anglo-Saxon army was recruited from semi-professional soldiers in the service of the king, as well as from people's militia, and was a temporary military force that was used both to participate in local conflicts and to defend the country, as for example under the leadership of King Harold at the Battle of Stamford Bridge and then at the Battle of Hastings. The Norman system of army formation proceeded from the feudal rule that all lands belong to the king, and he favors these lands to his supporters, who were obliged to provide him with military assistance. This assistance was expressed in a certain number of knights and soldiers provided to the king by landowners and tenants for the agreed time, usually for 40 days. These tenants often transferred part of their lands for use to their tenants, and they also assumed military obligations. Each knight provided himself with the necessary equipment: chainmail, subsequently replaced with full metal armor, a helmet, a spear, a sword and a shield, as well as at least one war horse. Each knight had attendants, a page for cleaning equipment and other services, a groom, grooming horse, and a servant. Troops were often replenished by squire and young aristocrats who sought to obtain knight title. Monasteries and bishoprics also had military obligations, usually but not always replaced by monetary compensations. The number of knights sent to the army by each landowner after the Norman conquest of England was steadily decreasing, in all likelihood because the equipment was becoming more and more expensive, and in 1217 115 tenants assigned the army only 470 knights. When Edward III ascended the throne, in England the peers class had not yet adopted a modern, orderly system of division into nobles' titles, such as the current Baron, Viscount, Count, Marquis, and Duke. Edward III was the first to introduce the title of Duke for his elder son, Prince of Wales. After the conquest of England, the Normans adopted the title Earl from the Anglo-Saxons, the same as Duke, but descended from the Scandinavian Jarl. And William I established the title of Baron, the lowest degree of estate in relations to Earl. But the title of a knight in these days did not have the same meaning as it is now, when there are two degrees of knighthood: a bachelor knight, only the king can entitle, and a baronet knight. Knight bachelor a title for life, and a knight baronet hereditary. Knight bachelors are called sirs, and their wives are called ladies. The baronet knights also called sirs, but on their letter after surname of baronet the letters Bart or BT are placed, short for English for baronet. The title of baronet knight is relatively low. It was introduced in the 1611 to replenish the royal treasury. In the Middle Ages, the system of noble titles was more flexible. To simply be considered a knight, it was enough to have a necessary equipment. If a man showed valor, courage, and military art, then, after time, more often before the battle, he was officially knighted. But the title of Banner Knight, abolished in 17th century, could only be obtained on the battlefield, and even then, as a rule, only if the king himself participated in the battle. The Banner Knight has the right to bear a rectangular banner, unlike knights below to the rank who were allowed to carry a triangular banner, as well as to have their own emblem and motto. The people who belonged to a knightly class prepared themselves for a military career, but above all for tournaments and knightly fights, and therefore in the battle with the enemy it was quite difficult to set them up to collective actions and to oblige them to strictly follow the battle tactics chosen by the military leader. Knights, knighted or not, were, according to today's concept, officers, and ordinary and sergeant personnel, continuing to speak in today's language, recruited from people fit for military service in districts and countries. But these people served in the army only for a certain time, and the recruitment into the army itself was accompanied by a constant debate who should support these people, local authorities or the government. When the king personally communicated with all large landowners of the kingdom, the feudal system of army formation worked more or less good, and the royal army successfully suppressed dynamic conflicts and Scottish intervention. But even then, the royal army could not conduct a campaign lasting more than 40 days, and to man personal garrisons when such need arose in any place. The soldiers could not be outside the house when it was time to perform agricultural work, and this greatly limited the scope and duration of a military campaign. Back in 1171, when the sons of Henry II opposed their father, it turns out that the army consisting of people who had been serving military service was reinforced by knightly for salaries. Given that the English monarchs would have fight outside the kingdom, mainly France and Scotland, and conduct lengthy campaign with the soldiers detached from home for this time, the transition from the feudal system of army formation to the recruitment of people serving for fee was undoubtedly a progressive phenomenon. Once the soldiers serve for a salary, they can be sent to those places where the king orders, and while he pays he can rely on them. In England, Edward I began to organize a professional army. He paid everyone except the highest military leaders. By this he laid the foundation for the brilliant victories of a grandson Edward III, gained out of the French armies exceeding the French army in quantitative composition, but formed according to the semi-feudal system of army recruitment. One way to recruit professional soldiers was to recruit foreign mercenaries willing to serve the highest bidder. People from badlands such as Brittany, from densely populated areas such as Flanders and Brabant, as well as from places where it was difficult to find a work such as for example Genoa, were hired by the English army. The recruitment of mercenaries into the army was accompanied by difficulties caused by the English antipathy towards foreigners, not completely absolved to date. And therefore the English army operating outside the kingdom had many mercenaries in Brittany and Flanders, and the troops operating on the territory of England relatively few. English even did not favor the Welsh soldiers, and they, after the end of military campaign, hurried to the nearest port to leave home. The recruitment of mercenaries into the army led, at least among the English, to a revision of view on the use of soldiers for various professional purposes. Previously, the main backbone of the army was mounted knights, who fought in armor and protective equipment. Their horses also carried armor covering their nose, chest and sacrum. The tactics of the battle were simple. Mounted knights went on the back, trying to scatter the enemy, crush all who met on the way. In some cases they were supported by poorly armed infantrymen and poorly trained militia. A knight is unthinkable without a warhorse. There is still a debate about the role of stirrups in mounted combat. Some historians believe that only after the device came into the use the knights were able to fight on the battlefield, and before that their destiny was reconnaissance and messenger service. According to the judgment of these historians, only the standing up and resting his feet on the stirrups, the knight could inflict a strong blow to the enemy without flying out of the saddle. Probably, for those who argue this way, horseback riding was not a usual thing. Stirrups, of course, are useful to maintain balance when the horse suddenly stiffens up and through the throttle. But the Roman saddles used by medieval knights were very convenient, and it was difficult to fly out of such saddle even without stirrups. Medieval saddles were like a chair and served as a rider's safety, and he could fly out of the saddle only if the horse fell, for example killed or wounded in battle. In this case the rider could break his neck or receive a fatal blow from an enemy who was nearby. In medieval drawing, armed horsemen were depicted in leather-long, ankle-weight pants and with outstretched legs, without any support of stirrups. It seems that the usefulness of stirrups appeared while mounting. Without them with heavy armor, it was difficult to get into the saddle. In addition to the warhorse, the knight needed a road horse for everyday riding and a pack horse for transporting property. The cost of fodder for 3 horses and the food for himself, not to mention the cost of horses and weapons, made the armed knight a very expensive participant in military campaigns, but the gradual ousting of knights from the battlefield was facilitated not by high equipment cost, but by the development of military art and the increase of the number of foot soldiers in the army. During the Welsh Wars, the English began to doubt the merits of an army such was composed mainly of knights. The rough terrain of Wales did not make it possible to allow to fight the enemies in open battle, and the English themselves suffered significant losses from the archers who climbed the hills, showered the enemy with a hail of arrows, and disappeared. In 1302, in Flanders, near Cambrai, French mounted knights suffered heavy losses from the infantry as well. Flemish dug wide and deep ditches in the path of the enemy cavalry, filled them with water and covered them with branches. When the knights went on the offensive, their horses fell into the ditches, and the rider also got into the water. The infantrymen pierced them with picks, turning the battle into a massacre. Probably after the battle with Scottish army at Bannockburn, the English came to the conclusion that a well-organized infantry, albeit composed on call of bumpkins, could prevail over knightly cavalry if they fought in a predetermined place. 8 years later, Sir Andrew Hackley stopped the army of Lancaster, the leader of a baron's opposition to the king, with foot soldiers and archers who tried to cross the river Ur on the only bridge near Boroughbridge. And then the Hackley's archers stopped the enemy cavalry's attempt to cross the river. Innovations in the organization of battle were not immediately introduced and were the result of military practice. Many Scottish served as mercenaries in Europe and adopted the experience of the Flemish. In addition, the rulers were increasingly imbued with the proposition that mounted knights were too expensive participants in the military campaigns and began to seriously think about a cheaper alternative. But there is almost no doubt that English came to this idea after the unsuccessful outcome of the Battle of Bannockburn, and on the contrary successful actions in England during the military suppression of local conflicts, when various combinations of horsemen, infantrymen and archers were used in battle. The experience English received in the battles at Bannockburn and then at Boroughbridge benefited, and they used the acquired knowledge in the Battle of Dublin Moor and Halidon Hill. Under Dublin Moor, 6 miles northwest of Perth, on August 11, 1322, the 1500s army of Disinherited, commanded by Edward Balliol, listening to the advisers who replenished his army with the tacit consent of the king, defeated the 3,000 army of Robert Bruce, commanded by Donald Earl of Mar. The Disinherited lost in battle only 2 knights and 33 men-at-arms. The Scottish casualties are not known for certain, but they must have amounted to several hundred soldiers. On July 19, 1333, under Halidon Hills, 2 miles northeast of Berwick-upon-Tweed, a 4,000-strong English army under the command of Edward III defeated a 5,000-strong Scottish army led by Archibald Douglas, and this time the losses of English were much lower than the losses of enemy and were calculated by a knight, squire and 10 foot soldiers. The Scottish, according to some records, lost in the battle about 1,000 people, including 5 earls and Douglas himself. After the defeat of Scottish at Halidon Hills, they were no longer able to gather the army to fight the English, and the kingdom of Robert Bruce began to decline. The battles of Dublin Moor and Halidon Hills had much in common, which allowed the English to achieve brilliant victories with the armies smaller than the enemy's. The experience gained in this battle English fully used in the 100 Years' War. In both battles, the main backbone of the English army was archers, while the military leaders provided cover for the flanks and narrowed the front of the enemy with skillful actions. At the Battle of Dublin Moor, a squad of the Disinherited took up the defensive position on the very edge of the valley adjoining the steep hills, while at Halidon Hills the right flank of Edward covered the seashore and the left a river bordered by a marshland. In both cases the English fought with the Scots on foot, placing archers on the flanks, and in both cases English archers rained down a hail of arrows on the enemy flanks, forcing them to bow to the center and hereby narrow their fronts. By the time the Scottish reached the first English infantry line at the Battle of Dublin Moor, they had lost combat effectiveness and had to turn back and flee. When the English brought their cavalry into the battle, which began to pursue the enemy in order to finish them off. The defensive position of a terrain chosen in advance for the battle, the use of the archery on the flanks, not allowing the enemy to bypass the English army and disrupt the enemy's order, as well as positioning of infantry along the front with a depth of several lines, provided the English with reliable tactics used in 100 Years' War. Only when the English extended the general front and the French learned from their defeats did the English military advantage begin to fade. The English, for their victories over the enemy in 14th century, owe much to the weapon innovation, a longbow. Ordinary bows and arrows were used in the ancient times. Rocks painting in the Paleolithic and Neolithic times depicted people armed with these weapons are known. Soldiers of the auxiliary forces of the Roman army armed themselves with the ordinary bows. Such as weapons were used by both sides in the Battle of Hastings. When the ordinary bows were replaced by longbows, it is not known for certain, but this replacement did not occur immediately. It is likely that the Welsh were the first to use longbows in the second half of the 12th century, but there is no reliable evidence for this. The English were willingly armed with the longbow, an expensive and effective weapon. Although the longbow possessed significant destructive power, the opponents of the English were in no hurry to adopt these weapons, which caused considerable damage. According to the Weapon Act in 1285, the longbow should be stored in a safe place at home, trained in the archery in the shooting range, and was certainly taught from childhood, like in Scotland playing bagpipe, traditionally increasing the life of the weapon. Longbows were made from yew, both local and imported. Irish, Spanish, Italian. The length of a longbow, according to some historians, was 6 feet, exceeding the average height of a person. But it is more likely that the length of these weapons of the English did not exceed 5 feet and 2 and 3 inches. At first the same craftsmen made bows and arrows, but then they split up. Some began to make bows, other arrows. The string weight was approaching 100 pounds. The weight of arrows was a cloth yard, and the effective range of a longbow reached 300 yards. There are still disputes about what the cloth yard was, a measure of the length of the Flemish warriors, many of whom moved to English during the time of Edward III. According to various estimates, the cloth yard ranged from 27.25 inches to 37 inches, although according to some sources 1 English eel is 45 inches, and it is unlikely that a longbow arrow could be so long. But no matter how long the arrow was, it took a lot of work along with the high technology to make it. The craftsmen should have acquired the appropriate material for the shaft. Ash was usually used. Cut the shaft of the required length and shape, and attach the tip of the feather into it, stabilizing the fight. 3 goose feathers were used for feathering, but the goose had only 6 feathers suitable for arrows, 3 on each wing, and although these feathers lost by the goose were naturally renewed every year, for the hundreds of thousands of arrows used during the war in England, in those times there should have been a large number of geese. The arrowheads were 2 types, with teeth to defeat the person not protected by armor, and without them, but narrower and sharper, so they could pierce the armor. According to some sources, the arrow pierced an inch oak board from the distance of 100 yards, but then in order to break through battle armor, it should be hurled from a shorter distance and by straighter path. Usually archers were located next to each other and shoot with volleys at the angle of 45 degrees, so that the arrow hit the target from above. But in battle, if the arrow only wounded the horsemen equipped with an armor, their horses lost proper control and spread panic. The rate of experienced archer reached from 10 arrows per minute. In 1315, at the Battle of Agincourt, 5,000 archers of Henry V, who fought in the French, could shoot 25,000 arrows every half minute and demoralize the enemy with their no-stop hail. Another weapon innovation in the 14th century was a crossbow, a steel bow pulled by a bowstring and attached perpendicular to a wooden box. It hurled steel or iron bolts and possessed tremendous penetrative power and greater accuracy than longbow. But due to the constant complex reloading, which took time, the crossbow fired only 2 arrows per minute. But learning to use this weapon was much easier. The English used this weapon to protect castles and fortresses. In the field during the battle, crossbowmen could mount a large shield on support, like easel, and behind it, without fear of enemy fire, reload crossbows. The French used crossbowmen, but in their armies the crossbowmen were mainly replenished with mercenaries, and just a few of their own. As for the longbow archers, there were not many of them in the French troops. The French believed that it was unreasonable to train such archers. In England, bows and arrows were produced in large numbers. In 1341, when Edward III returned from France and decided to recruit a new army to continue military operations on the continent, the government purchased and stored 7,700 bows and 12,800 bunches of arrows in the Tower. The bunch consisted of 24 arrows, so the total amount purchased was 307,200 units, for the feathering of which 153,600 geese lost 6 feathers each. But this huge number of arrows was only enough for only the 3-minute shooting of 10,000 archers, whom Edward was given to take with him to the war. The number of purchased arrows was constantly growing, and in 1421 425,000 arrows were placed in the tower for storage. This time 212,500 geese were damaged. Longbow production in English was planned. The sheriff received a special order from the manufacturer of a certain number of bows, bowstrings and arrows in their district. Sheriff placed the order in the local artisan, received manufactured goods, packed them and sent them to the towers for storage. The bows could be white, without surface protection, or impregnated with oil, but not painted, because when bending the bow, when it was given the necessary curvature, the paint on the bend could crumble. In 1346, when Edward again went to war in France, there were both mounted and foot archers in his army, which reduced the speed of movement, and in all subsequent times most of the archers rode on horses, but they fought as always in foot formations. Archers were in iron or steel helmet and a short sleeveless quilted jacket. Archers were very profitable soldiers. Bows and arrows were cheap. Their manufacture, encouraged by laws, provided jobs for many people, and of course, most importantly, the army, which included archery, could defeat the enemy that outnumbered it. In the 14th century in England, heavy armed horsemen gave way to soldiers with lighter weapons, but these were still mostly people of noble blood, from the knights and those who hoped to get this title, the squires and minor noblemen, usually in the ratio of 1 knight to 4 other kind. Like mounted archers, they rode on horseback and fought on foot, which led to a partial change of weapons. These soldiers usually wore chainmail, unlike French who preferred full metal armor, and were armed with shields smaller than the previous ones. Later they completely abandoned the shields. Although they were equipped with a sword, a battle axe, mace, dagger, and the main weapon was a halberd. The chronicles do not tell how these soldiers fought, but they probably lined up in 2 or 3 rows, depending on the width of the front, and were located close to each other, but not so much as they interfere with their neighbors, apparently shared about 2.5 feet. The English army also included a detachment of spearmen, mainly from Wales. On a battlefield they lined up in a large deployment formation, putting forward their spears. When bumped into, the enemy soldiers got injured, and they finished up, as chronicles said, with knives. In fact, shortened swords were used. In addition to lancers, the infantry included gunmen and scouts, mostly from Wales, Cornwall, Ireland, and a small number from Scotland, armed with daggers and short spears. On the battlefield they finished off the wounded enemy. In the middle of the 14th century, there were almost no heavy armed horsemen in the English army. However, the cavalry as before was needed, and they began to form lightly armed horsemen, hobbilars, sometimes called as armati. They had stand horses, Irish hobbies, but hobbilars were now used not in battles with the enemy, but for patrolling communications, reconnaissance, and finding places where you can replenish food supplies. Most of the English troops rode on horses, and therefore needed grooms and blacksmiths. The army was accompanied by a convoy with fodder, brought from England or purchased or even confiscated. In addition, the English army included demolition workers necessary for siege of enemy fortresses, masons and carpenters for construction of crossing and fortifications, craftsmen for the manufacture and repair of bows and arrows, and even a military band. The army could also have several cannons, but the chronicles do not directly mention this. The English army in the time of Edward III consisted of three types of soldiers: served in the retinue of the king and the retinue of the barons, contracted mercenaries recruited by the king and government, as well as people recruited into the army by the authorized recruitment commissions. The suites were composed of troops and landowners, and people recruited under the contract, as were the mercenaries of the king and government. The troops of landowners consist of tenants who had feudal obligations to their lords. Contract soldiers who served under the contract were hired by people with a rank from baronet or higher and required to serve a certain time, but more often for life. The contract determined the salary of a soldier, duties, and the place where he will serve, in England or abroad. The contract also, as a rule, stipulated that a certain share of military booty captured by the soldiers were transferred to its employer. Soldiers obliged to serve only his employer and no other without the agreement of the parties. The contract sealed, and each side received a copy. Only knights or squires were obliged to wear a uniform determined by the employer. The numerical composition of the suite was different. Thus, the retinue of the Earl of Northampton, recruited in 1341, consisted of 7 bannerets, 74 knights, 199 horsemen, 200 lancers and hobblers, and 100 archers. Earl of Derby's retinue, recruited in 1342, consisted of 5 bannerets, 50 knights, 144 squires, and 200 horse archers, some of which fulfilled their feudal obligation and the others served under contract. The retinue of a small nobleman was much smaller. For example, the retinue of John Bosham consisted of 5 squires, 6 horsemen, and 4 mounted archers. The knights had feudal obligation, and it was important for the government that there were a lot of knights in the country, so it tried different ways to convince the noblemen to be knighted. Of course, for the knights who went to the war as a part of someone's retinue or by their own free will, this title was advantageous, for they receive a greater salary than the untitled soldiers, and if they took a rich man as a prisoner, they themselves received a ransom. However, the cost of weapons, equipment, horses, and the maintenance of some of the servants was shocking, but those who refused to serve were fined. Under strong monarchs, Edward I, Edward III, and Henry V, there were few who refused to serve. Under the weak and unpopular monarchs, Edward II, Richard II, Henry VI, knights often evaded military service. The mercenaries recruited by king and the government served in the army in some way as mercenaries in someone's retinue, but had no obligation to a particular baron. Contracts were concluded not only with soldiers but also with people who were obliged to recruit for a certain time. In the designated area, the agreed number of soldiers of a required specialization. The condition of service of these soldiers were determined in advance. The number of recruits thus was also different. In 1341, Captain Edward Montagu pledged to collect 6 knights, 12 men-at-arms, 12 spearmen, and 12 archers for £76 in Brittany. But Sir Hugh Calveley managed to recruit 1,000 people in the same Brittany. At the beginning of the 100 Years' War, soldiers were recruited into the English army by recruitment commissions, the basis of which was the military duty of a civilian population. Such a recruitment was not much different from Saxon times. Initially, the number of soldiers recruited by recruitment commissions exceeded the number of mercenaries, but gradually the number of professional soldiers increased more and more. With the exception of residents of coastal areas, all men from 16 to 60 years of age were drafted into the army. The recruitment commissions consisted of royal surgeons, knights in the service of the king, and local officials. Well, it would be easier to use the local authorities to recruit soldiers into the English army if it wasn't bribery. Local recruiters exempted those who did not want to serve in the army for the bribe, and often recruited people unfit for military service. Royal sergeants and knights of the kings were not so corrupt. In addition, they themselves had military experience and therefore recruited suitable people into the army. However, often the people most suitable for the army were already drafted into the retinues of the local aristocrats or became mercenaries. In addition, not everyone had weapons, and according to the decision of the local authorities, those who were not subject for military service had to pay for the weapons of those who went into the army. The recruitment of the troops served as an incentives. People were assured that during the war they would be allocated a certain share of military booty of up to £100, which amounted to 20 years of archery's salary. In addition, a pardon was declared to outlaws. According to existing procedures, if a person suspected of a crime persistently ignored the subpoena, he was declared outlawed and could be even killed without the fear of consequences. True, if a person having committed a crime in one country moved to another, when he couldn't be accused for a crime but the crime did not go unpunished, the property of such person was confiscated in the favor of the crown. Only the king could pardon in exchange for military service in the English army, but pardon usually came into the force only after the end of military service and subject to positive certification by the commander. In 1339-1340, 850 people were pardoned, a third of whom committed murder. In all likelihood, pardoned criminals were made up at 1/10 of the English army. Soldiers called up for military service by recruitment commissions were combined in Vintenari 20s. This unit was commanded by a Vintenar, junior officer. 5 Vintenarii constituted a centenarium, 100, which was commanded by a centenar, centurion. He was supposed to have a horse, even if his subordinates were footmen. It is little known how recruits received military training, but there must have been a special, perhaps week-long training course that included archery. Although in these days the soldiers were not forced to walk in line, they were probably required to keep up with each other, so that they could quickly form a battle formation when needed. The soldiers had to fight as a whole, to obey orders unquestioningly, and understand military language and to handle weapons surely. Physical training and the ability to live in the field must not have been as important as for current recruits, but it is clear that in those days the soldiers were trained to provide first aid and required personal hygiene. The soldiers wore a uniform which helped them control and maintain discipline, but there was no uniforms in the current understanding of them. Many units were uniform according to the accepted standards, and wealthy barons often competed with each other in the choice of equipment of the soldiers. Most of the soldiers wore the form of light tones. The uniform of others had some differences. So Welshmen wear quilted tunics, white on one side and green on the other. Londoners had red and white chevrons on the sleeves. But although the soldiers of English army wore a more or less identical uniform, in the heat of a battle when various standards and banners of military leaders fluttered everywhere, it was not easy to distinguish friend from foe, and therefore, following in the example of his grandfather, Edward III ordered all soldiers to wear armband with the image of a red cross of St. George. The English army paid also to the people who fulfilled their feudal obligation. The pay was daily, as at present, and depended on the rank and social status. After the naval victory of Sluys, the English no longer feared of French invasion, but the possibility of an enemy's raids on the coast still remained. The defense of the coastal regions of England was entrusted to local authorities, which resulted in the organization, with the approval of the king, the coastal defense, which consisted of the headquarters of coastal watchmen and the warning service. The coastline of single lights that were lit when the enemy landed. Each signal light was served by 4 to 6 observers. They put on top of each other 3 barrels filled with sand and climbing on them monitored the sea. The churches also were asked to ring when necessary onto one bell and arrange a chime only when enemy landed. The coastal area of England was considered to be territory that extended from the sea into the land into 3 leagues, 9 miles. Residents of these areas were not subject to military service in the other parts of the kingdom, but for the large landowners there was a restriction of another, burdensome nature. They were urged to live in their county, so that the event of an enemy invasion to gather and lead militia. There was also an agreement that in the event of an enemy attack of a coastal county, a militia from nearby counties, away from the sea, should come for help. Nevertheless, it was difficult to prevent the people of the coastal areas from changing their place of residence, especially for the inhabitants of the Isle of Wight, Portsmouth and Southampton, who suffered from the enemy raids most often. Nevertheless, such a system of protecting coastal areas from the enemy attacks, which the French turned out to be, helped repel short-term raids. But it could not possibly cope with the large-scale invasion of England. Fortunately, after the Battle of Sluys, the enemy no longer threatened the English with a large-scale invasion into the country. Well, that's it for today. Hope you like it. Like it if you do, subscribe if you don't want to miss more. Thank you very much. Bye bye.